Good afternoon. Welcome to Hudson Institute. My name is Jonas, Parello-Plesner, and I'm here to moderate and kick off this afternoon's debate on Syria and Trump. Should I stay or should I go now? We had wanted to play also the sort of the class theme music for it, but you will just have to sort of hear that in your head. I'm not going to sing for you. But it sort of encapsulates our story today about U.S. strategy in Syria. I have drafted this paper here as a scene setter for today's debate. I think it's all out in the front where you can get a paper copy, and it's up on our website. That one has a less sort of quirky title and is called Post-Conflict Stabilization in Syria and the Potential Impact of U.S. Military Withdrawal, which is one of the themes that we're going to talk about today. And it's part of my own sort of ongoing research project on post-conflict stabilization in the ISIS-liberated areas in Syria and Iraq. So back to sort of the Clash theme song, Should I Stay or Should I Go Now? On April the 3rd, Donald Trump surprised many, including his own military leaders, when he announced in what seemed like a new Syria policy, stating, I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home. And Trump added that the U.S. had gotten nothing out of $7 trillion spent in the Middle East over the last 17 years. And Trump has additionally also put the brakes on $200 million of U.S. stabilization funding in Syria. A rumor on that actually goes that Trump did because the funding was labeled a donation in a Washington Post article. So that actually shows sort of the power of the press and what words you use about things. On that same day, April the 3rd, a month ago, the United States Institute of Peace, I was actually over there. They had a sort of brilliant setup panel of CENTCOM Commander General Votel, who's responsible for the military campaign against ISIS, State Department envoy to the coalition, Brett McGurk, and USAID Administrator Mark Green. And they were sort of describing plans for a continued U.S. presence in Syria, both to finish the job militarily and to build resilience against ISIS resurgence through post-conflict stabilization. So, for example, Votel told the audience, the hard part, I think, is in front of us, and that's stabilizing these areas, consolidating our gains, getting people back to their homes, and there's a military role in this. So the divergence in views between sort of Trump and the Trump administration was pretty sort of evident. Trump's take, of course, appeals to his domestic political base and is in keeping with his campaign promises to avoid giving out American taxpayer money for unnecessary wars reconstructing in the Middle East. Nevertheless, many in his administration and beyond sort of harbor reservations about a too hasty withdrawal for a couple of reasons. First of all, the military job of defeating ISIS is not over. Turkish incursion into the north has made the endgame harder because many of the Syrian Kurdish SDF forces, who've otherwise fought ISIS valiantly, have redeployed towards the north. And SDF has just taken up the fight against ISIS, but with an expected sort of slower tempo. Then another theme is Trump's insistence on burden sharing, which is a sort of consistent theme for him. I would even add foreshadowing the sort of current debate. Already back in 2013, Trump tweeted about Syria, why are these rich Arab countries not paying us, ? And Trump has really been sort of working hard on that type of solution of for example, getting allies and partners to pay more, and has been trying to get Saudi Arabia to sort of step up so that the U.S. would have possibilities to withdraw from Syria. But so far, the much touted Saudi Arabian-led forces and funding for Syria has not materialized. Another option could be that the UN should do more. They've just gotten access to Raqqa, and but that, of course, entails the consent of both Assad and thereby Russia as well. European allies have stepped up quite a bit particularly both on demining and stabilization, but it would not alleviate the shortfall if the U.S. sort of continues to freeze on stabilization and withdraws. This is all part of a sort of, for Trump, of a no nation building approach. In Iraq, that was enforced in that way where the U.S. did not provide public money for Iraqi reconstruction at the Iraqi Reconstruction Conference in February. On the other hand, the US has, in Iraq, continued to contribute generously with both humanitarian assistance and stabilization. Let me just, for definition, mention that stabilization is a term, sort of post-conflict stabilization, about the sort of quick fixes after conflict, such as demining, rubble removal, and getting electricity and water flowing again. For an ISIS ghost town such as Raqqa, the former capital of the terror regime, such stabilization is essential also for refugees to return. And inside the administration, there's been a sort of effort to fence off stabilization from reconstruction and to move it away from the sort of no-go nation-building restriction. And that distinction was evident when USAID Administrator Mark Green at that same USIP conference that I mentioned earlier in early April talked about stabilization programs are more than just manifestations of American generosity. They are instead key components of our national security planning. Although Trump seems to have abandoned that distinction in Syria by freezing the stabilization funds, which are also used for demining and part of these sort of quick fixes, which makes it possible for refugees to return. So on stabilization in Syria is not only essential for refugees to return, but also sort of bulwark against the quick return of ISIS. If the US were to pull out very quickly, it would both lose options to curb Iran, it would lose options to influence a political solution in Syria, and both US civilian advisors and allies need the US military umbrella to continue the stabilization works. So as a sort of intro, I mean, there are really longer term consequences to watch out for if Trump is really to sort of pull out the US military and discontinue stabilization funding. There are sort of instances of Obama when he was very quick to pull out of Iraq, and sort of what later fateful sort of consequences that also had. So there's a lot at stake around how this is going to play out over the coming months. So that's what I have a stellar panel here up with me to talk about. On my left, I have Mariam Jalabi, who is representative of the Syrian Opposition Council to the United Nations. All the way out here to my right, I have Mohammad Al Abdallah, who is a Syrian human rights and democracy researcher and activist. And last but not least, I have my colleague, senior fellow Mike Doran, who has been an active voice on all issues Middle East since, at least since you were in the Bush administration and here at Hudson. So I would start with you, Mike, after my sort of scene setter, and help us discuss your thoughts about sort of why or why not sort of a U.S. withdrawal from Syria would be in the national interest, and of course include one of the topics that's always first and foremost on your mind, which is Iran policy and how it would limit or change U.S. opportunities to curb Iranian regional influence and in Syria.
Well, thanks. So I think President Trump, as you mentioned, his base is very skeptical of the Syria mission, and it's not just his base. So it's even, I would say, the American electorate writ large. There's real continuity between, on that level, between President Obama and President Trump. President Trump is afraid that Syria is going to become like Afghanistan, that by the time he leaves office, whether it's in 4 years or 8 years' time, we're still going to be in Syria with no end game in sight, and that this is going to be held against him. And so his inclination is to think in short term in that regard, and he's asking his advisors to give him the plan, and they're not doing it. I interpret that the statement from early April when he said we're about to get out, a little bit of electioneering in a sense, or playing to his base, but I see it as a way of kind of challenging his advisors as well to come up with the plan. As against that, there are the interests that you mentioned, and President Trump has been more inclined to compete with the Iranians in the Middle East and in Syria than President Obama. Not to compete with them necessarily militarily. It was very striking last month when former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson came out with a policy statement saying it was a policy of the United States to counter Iran in the Middle East. And then General Votel, the commander of CENTCOM, went before Congress shortly thereafter, 2 weeks after Tillerson made his statement. And General Votel was asked what the U.S. military is doing to counter Iran in Syria. And he said explicitly, it's not a U.S. military mission to counter Iran in Syria. So there's an inherent contradiction there. On the one hand, we're containing Iran in the Middle East, but we're not containing it militarily in Syria, where it is expanding militarily. So how can you have a containment policy if that's if you have that contradiction? But just because there's a contradiction doesn't mean there's not an inclination to want to contain Iran. And so that is one of the factors that's leading, one of the major factors that's leading the Trump administration to stay in, a factor pushing to stay in Syria, not necessarily to go contain Iran, but at least to prevent the territory in the Middle Euphrates River Valley in particular that we're currently holding from becoming a Russian and Iranian asset. The other thing, the contradiction that they're dealing with, is the fact that others will not step up and contribute. The Saudis in particular, but not only, to the reconstruction and stabilization of Syria if the United States is not committed. So the idea is, I mean, some people are thinking, well, we should pull out and let others do it. Well, others won't do it if the United States isn't involved. And the United States leadership is the absolute essential ingredient to ensuring that others are going to make the kind of commitment that the United States wants them to make. So that's another kind of contradiction that they're having to grapple with. There are two allies that I think are at the forefront of their minds, or for simplicity's sake, let's think about it in terms of two allies. One is Turkey and one is Israel. With regard to Turkey, as you mentioned, Jonas, that the U.S. is fearful that if it pulls out, the Russians and Iranians will become the primary interlocutor between the Syrian Kurds and the Turks. I mean, we have to realize that we built, whether we call it that or not, we built a Syrian Kurdish statelet, which was extremely threatening to the Turks, and the Turks are hostile to the statelet that we built, and we are the guarantors right now of the security of the Syrian Kurds. If we leave, they'll go to the Russians and to the Iranians, and the Russians will then become the interlocutors with the Turks. I think the administration understands, the military understands, that it wants the United States to be in that position, because at stake in all of this is the international orientation of Turkey. If the Russians take over that relationship, being the mediator between the Kurds of Syria and the Turks, they will use it to pressure the Turks and detach the Turks from NATO. Whether not necessarily leave NATO, but they can become a kind of thorn in the side of the United States in NATO. And so the only possible way to prevent the Turks from falling under the wing of the Russians or gravitating closer to the Russians is for the United States to stay there in Syria. And similarly, there's an issue with the Israelis. The Israelis are, as we know, you can see by reading the newspaper, they're very fearful about the rise of the Russian-Iranian alliance in Syria, primarily the Iranian component of the Russian-Iranian alliance, but it comes as a package because the Russians provide the air cover and the Iranians provide the ground troops. And that contest between the Israelis and and the Iranians is escalating. You know, it was come to light just recently. The Israelis took this archive of the Iranian nuclear program from Iran in January or February, about a week after they took it to Israel. The Iranians sent an armed drone. This is back in February. They sent an armed drone into Israel. That could very well have been retaliation against the Israelis for taking the archive out. There's been a couple of tit-for-tat exchanges, quite significant ones between the Iranians and the Israelis since. And you remember just last week there was that massive explosion in Hama when the Iranians brought in some possibly 200 anti-aircraft missiles to defend their positions against the Israelis. So the Israelis have been humiliating the Iranians both by taking the archive out and by showing that they can attack them in Syria. The Iranian response is coming. The Iranians keep threatening it. They haven't done it yet. It's coming. So there could be a significant escalation there. I think the Americans look at this as they do with everything in Syria, with contradictory emotions. On the one hand, they fear a Israeli-Iranian contest, and they fear the reverberations for the United States. On the other hand, the inclination is to support Israel against the Iranians, and it makes the consequences of an abrupt U.S. pullout, working to the advantage of the Iranians and Russians, all that much more dramatic and detrimental in the long run to U.S. interests. So, you know, balancing all of those contradictory impulses, I think we're sort of muddling through, supporting the Israelis in terms of giving them diplomatic backing for them to police their red lines, but not associating ourselves with their red lines. Trying to keep our boys out of harm's way to the extent possible, but recognizing that we're also part of the mix. So my own answer to all of this is that we should actually define Israeli red lines as our red lines, in the interest of the United States. That is, Israeli red lines are that regard no attacks against Israel by the Iranians from Syrian territory, no transfer of strategic weaponry from Syria from Iran through Syria to Hezbollah, no Iranian or Hezbollah forces in Syrian territory just opposite the Israelis in the Golan. We should announce that we support these red lines and they are in the American interest. And I think that would increase our leverage over the Russians. But I think that my recommendation will not win the day, because the inclination in the military is to see that as an escalation, and that will cause us more trouble rather than less. And it will work against the desire to get us out of there as soon as possible.
Great, Mike. Just a quick follow-up on that. Do you see with the new Secretary of State Pompeo as a stronger line on Iran? Could you see a push to sort of expand the military mission and to include sort of Iran in that, in sort of for the American forces in Syria? Which is basically the opposite of what Trump wants to pull them out.
It wouldn't surprise me at all, but he will run into a brick wall in the form of the Secretary of Defense.
Thanks. With that, I'll turn over to you, Mariam, and of course, as a representative of the Syrian opposition, I wanted your thoughts on all of this, but also in particularly on the whole question of a political solution, something that in former Secretary Tillerson was sort of a strong component of his sort of Syria strategy for the U.S. of supporting the UN-led Geneva format. At the same time, there's also the sort of competing format with Astana, which is led by the Russians, the Iranians, and which includes the Turks. So, so I wanted to have your thoughts on that.
Yes, thank you for having me here. I want to bring it back. I really like listening to Michael now, putting like a whole international perspective of what's happening to Syria. But I think what I want to do is bring it back to how we Syrians in Syria, or Syrians, feel about what's happening on the ground, at what needs to happen in the leadership of the U.S. Because the U.S. has sidelined its leadership, or is trying to give it over to people who are not willing to take over, like the whole burden sharing, the whole idea about there's somebody else who's going to come step in and do it. There's no one else on this side. There's Iran and Russia on the other side who are stepping up and taking up the role to boost this government to stay in power and to keep doing the atrocities it's doing. And I think what I want to go back to is that a few weeks ago when the US strike in Syria, that was the second time ever the Assad regime has ever gotten any, kind of a slap. You can call it maybe slap on the wrist. It was very limited. It was very cautiously done. It was arranged with everybody on the ground, a strike with no casualties that was planned for over 2 weeks. But what I want to remind people here is that this is the Russians and the Assad regime are on the ground thinking that their next move is a military win. This is what they want. They want to take back over the country and get to a place where they are in full control. And us sitting back and not responding to that, like the US administration not responding to this takeover of the Syria with impunity, with the kind of atrocities that they've been creating. Not just chemical weapons. Yeah, chemical weapons, maybe internationally illegal use of weapons, but that is 1% of the cause of death in Syria. What's happening on the ground is that the regime is using conventional weapons and illegal weapons, indiscriminate weapons, with the help and support of Iran on the ground, the Russians from the air, to create mass atrocities. Just from the time that the US had hit the strikes in suburbs of Damascus, in Ghouta, there has been over 400 people that have been killed by conventional weapons. There have been over 150,000 people that have been displaced from their neighborhoods and areas. And the regime now is moving into areas of Homs, that's another major city in Syria that's taking over again. So unless we see some kind of a leadership, a comprehensive, clear, and sustained leadership from the US to deter this government and its allies from continuing the kind of policy they're continuing on the ground, I don't see any push that could happen for the political solution. Because this is a regime that understands only one language, and that's the language of force. And they will keep using this and going forward until there is a leadership that's taken by the US to stop this regime from continuing this tactic, and B, I sometimes say it bombed to come to the table, because that's the only place, that's the only way that they're gonna come and negotiate. And in connection to Astana, I want to say that Astana started because the US had taken sideline. And this is in continuation a little bit of the Obama policy also. When the US sidestepped, Turkey went over to, shake hands with the Russians because they needed to protect their own national security. They have their own interests in the region. So it created a whole other, which is a weird alliance of Iran, Turkey, and Russia. So when they started the whole Astana process, which is actually directly connected, supposedly at the beginning, they said it was a military de-escalation a strategy that is going to be helping the Syrians on the ground and trying to create a stable situation to create a political solution. And then they started actually talking a political solution in Astana. They handed over a constitution, to the rebels to overlook it and to give their input on it. That's when it felt like, no, there has to be something else done on a political track. And then the UN picked up and Geneva started again. And now in round 9, we've done round 9, and it's still no tangible results because the strategy on the ground and the language on the ground is completely removed from what's happening in Geneva. That doesn't seem the right way to go. What we want to see as Syrians, as the opposition, is that there has to be a political solution in the end. It can't be a military solution. There are a lot of countries that are involved. There are a lot of interests that are involved. And it's a geopolitical issue for the whole region. It's not just for Syria. The existence of Russia and Syria is connected to their existence in Ukraine, to their deals, to the economic situation in the region, to their deals with the EU, with NATO, with all of that. But how could all of this be put together in a way that creates a sustainable solution for the future for Syria is to bring everybody to the table and to have that negotiation in Geneva and to have people come sit with a genuine and real interest in creating this kind of a transition. This is not going to happen by the regime. This is not something that the regime wants because it's not going to work its own interest. So the only ones who are capable of doing this are actually the regime and the Russians and the Iranians and maybe the Turks now through the Astana, like through them getting involved in the Astana process. So the way I would put it, just to sum it up, is that we need US leadership on this, because if the US does not take lead in this, others will not, as Michael very well put in his explanation. And in order to come to a solution with this kind of leadership, we need to bring this regime through their allies to the table to discuss a comprehensive solution. And comprehensive means relating back to the other policies. It's not just about, like, strikes and deterrence on the ground, but it also brings it back to this whole stabilization funds that are going inside Syria, because as long as there is no support for the moderates on the ground, for people who are actually keeping the peace, people like the white helmets on the ground, there's creating a vacuum for others, for more extremist groups to take over, which is part of the security, international security, and the US security. And the other thing that also I want to talk about is that a comprehensive solution means also to differentiate between when we're talking about stabilization funds and reconstruction funds. Reconstruction funds, we have been talking about, it should not be going through the government, because this will give the government legitimacy and rehabilitation to become part of the ones that are actually rebuilding Syria, and that is not going to help Syrians in the end. And also, I think this is what Mohammad is going to talk about also. This has to be also connected to the atrocities that are happening, the crimes, war crimes that are happening on daily basis by this regime, and the call for an accountability, that this kind of an impunity cannot continue, because it is creating a set of a new world order of where any totalitarian government can actually do whatever it wishes on the ground to its own people, and just be let loose to keep on doing that, which we have seen where the ramifications of it has ended in Europe, in like all over the region, the ISIS growth. And as you mentioned, we have not gotten rid of ISIS fully yet in Syria. And there isn't only ISIS, there are a lot of other groups that are also rogue elements in Syria that need to be controlled. So I see no end in sight unless there's some kind of a leadership that is coming forward by the US administration to push for this political solution and to stop the atrocities that are happening on the ground.
Thanks, Mariam. Just a follow-up question on for you as well. So, if you don't end up seeing this US leadership that you're asking for the Syrian opposition, would then dealing with Russia be an opportunity or possibility?
We are actually in talks with everybody who can create some kind of a change on the ground. Like, we're very much in, like, as an opposition, we're in Turkey, we're in Istanbul, our headquarters are in Istanbul, and we're in constant dialogue with Turkey, and Turkey is directly connected with Russia. But the Russian regime, I want to call it, has proven that has no interest in protecting civilians on the ground. And no matter how much we will be talking to them, on how much we Syrians will talk to anybody to try to create any kind of change on the ground that is keeping the human rights concept, the international law respected, and that is not happening through Russia. We're hoping, like, it's the international, like a Western international community, like the US, who believe in human rights and who believe that there can be some kind of a democratic structure that will bring peace to the people on the ground. We don't want another Kadyrov, in Syria. If we work with the Russians, we'll just shift from one military, dictatorship to another dictatorship. That's not what we want. We want to shift to a democratic structure, to a real transition. This is where the trick comes in with Russia.
Sure, yeah. That's a good segue on human rights and what happens for individual Syrians on the ground. I want to transition to Mohammad, and who I want to commend for leading the Syria Justice and Accountability Center here in DC, but that works, of course, in and sort of out of Syria and documents war crimes as it takes place. So it's a sort of novel approach, and instead of what some of us have seen historically in Yugoslavia and so on, you waited until sort of after the war, and then you start collecting evidence. Is that you're doing this through social media, through other means on a sort of daily basis. And so I wanted your sort of civil society perspective on, at the beginning of the year and end of last year, there's some sort of positive thoughts about de-escalation in Syria. The fighting was winding a little bit down. Then Secretary Tillerson was talking about how the de-escalation zones would sort of work. So I wanted your perspective from sort of the ordinary Syrians caught in these different zones, whether you're in the far north now in Turkey zone, in Raqqa with STS-led and sort of with American stabilization money inside the regime. All your thoughts on how it looks for an ordinary Syrian in 2018 and onwards.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me. So it is really complicated to look on. Imagine a U.S. withdrawal from the eastern part of Syria, where the U.S. and SDF has been present, without putting together or thinking of the consequences and the concerns the average Syrians would really face. The first question comes to mind: who's going to fill this vacuum? Leaving this vacuum to SDF, who's not going to be able to govern these areas at their own, that make them vulnerable to attacks from the Turks directly to take over this area, or handing the area to Russia and Iran in different basically power structures in these areas. That sets the stage for the next step, which is the elimination of Geneva track at all and reintroducing Sochi and Astana tracks. If we look at what the US and France did with the recent Sochi conference, the US withdrew, said we're not going to go to Sochi, and France said we're not going to. So the conference kind of folded. President Putin did not attend, and then they kind of reduced the level of representation to Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. And then the whole conference ended up being just a show of or ceremonial environment celebrating the regime forces. What Russia did in response, taking over Ghouta and start attacking other places to acquire more areas and more territories on the ground to say, we control more areas in Syria, let's get back to the negotiation table. So the more the Russians control and the Iranians control, there's no counterbalance there, then the more we exclude Geneva track and the more we actually go towards Astana or Sochi or any other conference Russia and Iran will pull together. The withdrawal from eastern Syria would mean actually there's a vacuum and there's a competition there. Turkey is invited or not invited. There's still a big question mark there, whether the Turks will be able to control this area at their own, or there's the talk about Arab and Islamic forces will be reintroduced to Syria, Egyptians or other nationalities. Egypt foreign minister spoke about sending troops, and then the foreign ministry said, we're not going to send anyone there. So it's still a murky question, who's going to fill this vacuum? But with that vacuum in place, that's going to not only impact the peace negotiation, Geneva track, but also it's going to impact the nature and the type of the post-conflict regime being introduced to Syria now. Because without the Western bloc balancing the negotiation in Geneva and introducing the demands for human rights, for civil society, for rule of law, for justice and accountability, for fair stabilization, return of refugees, there's a million really difficult governance questions facing these areas. And then you're going to be having a regime just equal to the regime in Damascus, if not worse, being introduced in the eastern side. The missing ingredients, however, in all these things, that the US is undermining the leverage they have by their military presence in eastern Syria. We have forces. The US killed Russians when the Russians tried to go and attack the US forces and the Kurdish forces in Deir ez-Zor. And this is not precedent. This is new things. And we have leverage, and we can use this leverage. And I want to agree and disagree with Mariam's remark on the use of military force. It was a slap in the wrist. It was limited. That's the military impact of the attack. But the political value of the attack is way beyond that. It means we can go outside the Security Council. Now, this time, it's not only the United States. We're bringing UK and France with us. 3 of the P5 are going out of the Security Council to do something to counter Russia, who's blocking the Security Council. And this is kind of reintroduce that level of balance we're talking about here, that the US, UK, France are basically standing up to the Russians and telling them, no, we're going to do things here. If you want to block the Security Council, we're going to do it from outside. So the missing ingredients here, how we're going to leverage all this power and put it to a diplomacy, to a peace negotiation. We don't hear much about that. We're going to withdraw, we're not going to withdraw. Geneva is there, but Sochi and Asitana. What's the faith of a peace agreement if the US withdraw prematurely from Syria? Let alone, of course, handing Syria to Iran the same way President Obama did with Iraq. Just leave quickly and hand everything to the Iranians. There's a question of the refugees' return, which is a big question, and it's strategic questions for the European allies. Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, a couple of European countries hosting 1.5 million Syrian refugees, let alone 2 million in Turkey, 1.5 million between Jordan and Lebanon. How those people will be returned if this area is handed to the regime, to the Russians, to the Iranians, and therefore to the Syrian government? You can only protect those people if there is kind of independent forces there, if there's any forces that people will trust. Interesting remark is on the ground, when people being forcibly displaced from their areas, recently from Homs and before from Ghouta, people are trusting the Russian military police checkpoints more than the Syrian government forces and intelligence, because the Russians will treat them better than what the intelligence in Syria or the security forces will treat them. There's the question of the ISIS return. Was ISIS really defeated? This is another big question mark. There's a new Qaeda-like or a new Qaeda-related group being reformed and reestablished now between Idlib and the other of the pockets where ISIS was left. So to declare mission accomplished and that we wiped out ISIS is just repeating the same mistake we've done in Iraq. Oh, we defeated Al-Qaeda with the help with Al-Sahwa and with the Saudis, and we're walking out, than to let Al-Qaeda reestablish itself in more extreme nature group, this time ISIS. God knows what the next group would look like. So that's another concern average Syrians would look at. And then the whole stabilization fund story. I just was in Brussels on April 25th. I attended a side event on justice and accountability, but the whole discussion and discourse on funding reconstruction from Brussels, and this is Brussels 2, the second year Brussels platform for funding and reconstruction between the UN and the EU. There's still emphasis, although the departure of Secretary of State Tillerson, the Europeans are still following the line of Secretary Tillerson. We're not going to fund any reconstruction in the regime areas. We're going to fund reconstructions only in the areas that's not controlled by the regime. And we're going to make sure this reconstruction fund leads to establishment of rule of law and good local council, good capacity of governance, and make sure there's fair human rights situation in this area. And that would facilitate the return of some refugees from Europe as well. So just withdrawing from Syria, imagine the scenario quickly. Russia and Iran controlling the area, Iran reconnecting Iran, Baghdad, Syria, Beirut, especially with the recent election results in Lebanon, with Hezbollah taking over more seats in the parliament and defeating the Sunni powers, Al-Hariri and the Saudi allies. So emboldening this Shia tunnel from Tehran to Beirut all the way. The Russians taking more territories so they can just remove or abandon Geneva track and go with their version of the solution, peace negotiation in Sochi or Asitana. You get the reconstruction fund taken by corrupted governments who's going to use it more in bad ways. They're not going to rebuild anybody's house. There's no refugees will be back from Europe. And then we're going to ask our partners, who's going to pay this money? It's not about funding. It's not about money. So when President Trump makes that, and I agree here with Mike's remark, it's basically we need the U.S. leadership in the field here to make others pay and to encourage others to contribute their share of the reconstruction fund and the stabilization money. The final comment I have is more what the U.S. might do if Turkey took over these areas and start playing their own model of local councils, bringing non-local people, empowering them as locals. And this is what's happening in the northern Kurdish area and the Afrin area, kicking the Kurds out and bringing non-Kurdish people and empowering them as local councils, and just saying, oh, we're doing what the U.S. is doing in other councils, in Raqqa and in Deir ez-Zor. So why it's bad here, it's good there. So just making sure how all these powers will fight over this small piece of Syria, that territory in the eastern the river is important, and not creating the vacuum that's going to empower the bad guys really to have a bad peace deal and will have basically disaster impacts on all the other things, ISIS, refugees, reconstruction, stabilizations.
Thanks, Mohammed. A quick question on that. What if then if we actually see allies stepping up more, giving more stabilization, European allies, as you mentioned, you've been to the Brussels conference on Syria, willing to do this, and in the areas that are now been liberated from ISIS, but then sometime in October, President Trump remembers this again, and it's like, hey, why haven't we pulled out? And then you see a pull out, and a lot of these stabilization money could basically also be wasted if then, even though you haven't insisted on human rights and not giving it to Assad, if then the Russians acquire it because the U.S. basically leaves. I mean, what are your thoughts on this?
So the good thing when President Trump dropped his words on we're leaving Syria quickly, that his military was actually the first group who said, no, we cannot do this. It's a premature step. We need more time. When he asked how long time, he was given an answer, a couple of months to a couple of years. And he said, I don't want to hear about this in 6 months, which I don't believe the Pentagon or the military folks will leave in 6 months. So if you look also, this is what comes from our field team on the ground, how many military bases has been established in this small area, how many Air Forces bases or air bases has been established, although the Pentagon calls them temporarily staging facilities. They are capable air bases to fly drones and to carry on operations. Specifically on the war against ISIS, for the first time, the U.S. just used their aircraft carriers from the sea. And this is in response to Turkey delaying the approval to use the base there, and also to show that actually we're fully independent here and capable of carrying this at our own without really regional allies, which also send messages to the Europeans, to the Turks, and to the regional power that we're here full scale. So after all these, like basically spending and these all resources and investing in the stabilization in the region, it's going to be very difficult to imagine the withdrawal. But to answer your question directly, I don't think the US can broker a deal with the Turks to come to the region and have good terms there. I don't think the US should let Iran and Russia control the deal. And yes, a premature withdrawal will mean basically wasting all the efforts the US have spent in the last year and a half from defeating ISIS till today.
Thanks. Let me open it more up here. Mike, you had a lot of interesting comments in your initial remarks and wanted to pick up maybe on burden sharing when you were talking about that you basically need the U.S. as part of this. And that's, I think, just as it has a broader point as well. How does the U.S. best make allies step up? Is it by actually doing more, or is it by pulling back, which is a sort of eternal question on both on defense budgets, on missions, and so on. So, and you seem to have your answer, but I wanted you to sort of go sort of deeper into that, because at the same time you have a president who's really insisting on a new type of burden sharing, and other allies should do this. So what's sort of really the best way for the U.S. to achieve that, for others to do more?
I think they have to walk a line. I think we have to recognize, first of all, that that we have interests in Syria. We didn't get there by accident, and there's a struggle for regional mastery going on in the Middle East, and the epicenter is Syria. America has a problem in looking at the Middle East like everybody else does. I mean, because we regard Syria as completely as a country in which we have no interests. This is a long story with Syria. I saw this very up close when I was in the Bush White House, actually, long before the George W. Bush White House, long before the Syrian civil war began. Syria was always an afterthought, because we don't have any major. It's not an ally. We don't have any major economic interests there. And the thought is always, well, others should take care of Syria. Well, now Syria is the center of everything in the Middle East. I mean, the contest that's going on there, and the fact that we're there, and the fact that we're reluctant to leave, is a recognition of that fact. But intellectually, we have not taken the next step forward and seen Syria for what it is. So we're always trying to think, oh, Syria, how can I get away from it? How can I avoid making the decision? And everything we say about Syria is not true for that reason, because we're actually managing a contradiction that we haven't admitted to ourselves. All the statements that we make are false. We don't think they're false. We think we're saying the truth when we say them, but they're not true. For example, the use of force against Assad for chemical weapons. I actually agree with both Mariam and Mohammed about the use of force. It was actually far too little to actually change the military balance. In fact, we rewarded Assad for the use of chemical weapons because he and the Russians, and the Iranians, they had a specific military goal for using the chemical weapons. It wasn't just to terrorize. They want to clear Ghouta, which is where the most significant Damascus-based opposition group is. So this is a strategic goal of theirs. And they calculated, well, maybe the Americans will actually carry out a reprisal against us. And they made the calculation. They thought, well, whatever the Americans do, it'll be enough that we can weather it. And in fact, it was enough that they could weather it. So we give ourselves credit for changing the political environment around the use of force, which in fact we did, but he still got what we wanted. So I think the key here is calibrating the use of force so that it sends a commitment, it sends a signal of commitment to our allies, and it sends a signal to the Iranians, the Russians, and Assad that things that they hold dear will be lost if they don't work with us politically. The only way you get the political, the Obama administration had this mantra: there is no military solution, and therefore we're not going to use our military. Well, the minute the Russians and the Iranians saw that we're not going to use our military, they said, you know what, there is a military solution, and they went to achieve it. So the only way that we can convince the Iranians and the Russians that there's no military solution is if we use our military in such a way to prevent them from seeking a military solution. So you have to calibrate the use of force so that you threaten your enemies seriously, your adversaries seriously, and so you send a commitment to your allies that is convincing. And then you turn to them and you negotiate with them, your allies. And you say, this is what we're doing, and we're willing to keep up at this level, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. Otherwise, the American people aren't going to buy it, and I'm going to have to. And I have to you have to minimize the commitment of U.S. forces on the ground, because the American public is not going to support this. And every president is aware of that. So you have to ask others to step up. But we have to be there. Only the United States can set the political goal, the strategic political goal, and can assign roles and missions. No other party can possibly do that, and can mitigate between all the different interests among the allies, because the allies don't agree with each other, right? The Turks have interests, the Israelis have interests, the Saudis have interests, and they don't all agree with each other. We're the only ones who can mediate between all of them.
Interestingly, you end up in something that's not too similar to Libya 211 of a leading from behind type of mission, or
no, there's no such thing as leading from behind. You can only lead. You can minimize, you can mitigate the risk of leading, but there is no substitute for American leadership. There just isn't.
Mariam, I wanted to turn to you and talk about stabilization and what it does on the ground, and because you put forward a sort of defense of that, and I think the two of us can easily agree on that here. It's sort of my research project, but again, it's something that's been increasingly questioned from sort of Trump's sort of instinct of no nation building, and so I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more on your defense, and also think about if you're sort of over here in this political landscape of how do you then convince about that this is very sort of short-term, time-limited, that this is not sort of the beginning of a new Afghanistan where the U.S. is with allies deployed for decades in basically a nation-building process.
Yeah, I want to say that we're looking for a comprehensive solution for Syria. And the military component that Michael talked about, and the human rights and the negotiations that Mohammed talked about, needs to be complemented by the kind of money that's going on the ground to be specifically going to the right places to keep that nation still that we're hoping that will be the nation that will take over the transition. One of the questions that we keep being asked is that, oh, what is the alternative to Assad? And the thing is that there has been this messaging put forward is that it's this dichotomy where you have either ISIS extremists or you've got the Assad regime. And that's not true at all. There is so much that is happening on the ground in Syria, not just, again, I'm not, forget about the diaspora, forget about all of the different other groups that are outside. There is so much work that's being done inside Syria with the local councils, with the civil society, with the women groups also, I want to say, that is, I am part of one of the founders of the Syrian Women Political Movement on the ground. And we have direct contacts to groups that are doing a lot of the keeping the fabric of society together, keeping the fabric of the social structures together on the ground. And unless there is funding that is going down to these groups to keep this kind of stabilization, it becomes very difficult for people not to leave. For people, the moderates, the ones who are keeping all of the different services going on the ground, delivering the aid, doing all of the medical supplies and the support on the ground, all of the real everyday today work that's being done on the ground needs funding, needs support. We're talking about, yes, the political high-level military solution, but once that comes into effect, where is it going to go in the end? Like, who are you going to count on the ground to do this? Therefore, it becomes very important that civil society, including people who are actually, like the white helmets. Why I use the white helmets? Because it has gotten a lot of bad rep from the regime and the Russians saying they're, a terrorist organization. These guys are the ones who run to an area that gets bombed. And the way the regime does the bombing is that they bomb first, and they destroy a building or wherever they want to hit, service center, hospitals and schools are their favorites to hit. So the white helmets, the civil defense groups come in to save the people from under the rebels, and this is their task. They come to actually support the people on the ground. The regime hits in 10-15 minutes later the same exact location because they want to kill more people who are coming to save these ones who are under the rubble. The White Helmets, this organization that has been supported by the US and many other countries, but stopping destabilization means stopping the funding to people who run to these areas. The second, knowing that there will be a second bombing coming in, they run to the area and they still save people. We need these people to continue on the ground because these are the ones who are actually creating the foundation, the ground for what can come and happen later on. And I want to mention, just because I'm going on this tyrant about civil society, is that before the revolution, before 2011, there were about 700, maybe Mohammed can correct me on my numbers, maybe about like 700 civil society organizations that existed in Syria. There were 23 million people in Syria, and no longer because of the refugee crisis, but there were only 700 civil society, and they were all overlooked and controlled by the government. Since the revolution started, there has been at least 2,500 civil society organizations that have sprung up locally and have taken on the burden of keeping the work on the ground happening. These are the people that the INGOs come and work with and do partners with. These are the people that when Security Council resolution did, cross-border and cross-line for delivery of aid and medical supplies, that they made partnership with them as implementers. And therefore it becomes very important that when we're looking at Syria in a comprehensive way, that we look at all of these different elements, that once you start creating a solution and there is some kind of a political transition happening on the ground, that these groups are still functional and strong and are there to able to take the responsibility and go forward in rebuilding and reconstructing the country. And this again relates to the national security, the international security, the US security, because these are the ones who are keeping the families. These are the ones who are educating children. There are 3 million children that are in school age in Syria that are not going to school. What happens to these children? You've got all of the ISIS camps. You've got all of the, the extremist camps that are happening there. How do you prevent this kind of extremism from not developing? Is by supporting the other side, the moderates, the people who are creating real change and keeping the social fabric together. They have to be supported and kept in check that they are doing their job on the ground.
That's a really important point, that notwithstanding war, there's still civil society organizations that are expanding and need support. I was going to one more question, which is sort of a little bit broader on from the view of the Syrian opposition and a political solution, would be the Kurdish issue. I mean, the fact that the Syrian Kurds are not sort of represented together with the opposition in the Geneva talks, and they now, of course, through sort of SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, and therefore, as we talked about earlier on the panel, there's of course a big interest, should the West withdraw from Russia, to sort of take over sort of patronage of the Syrian Kurds. So I was interested in, also because it's a big part now, 30% of the Syrian territory that's been liberated from ISIS, which is basically on the SDF control. How is Syrian opposition, you would see, sort of working together with the SDF and sort of...
When we're talking Kurds, this is one of the things that, one of the issues that are complicated about Syria is that there are so many different Kurds in Syria. There are 12 Kurdish parties in Syria. And it is not true that there are no Kurdish representation within the Syrian opposition. The Syrian opposition has many different groups, and one of the big representation as part of it is the Kurdish National Council that we have representation from, who are actually persecuted against by, when we say Kurds, like the SDF, we're talking pay a day. Yeah. We're talking the YPG. The YPG, which is connected. This is what makes it complicated, because those have actually connected to the PKK. Their national interest is connected somewhere else outside Syria. And we have seen sometimes, like for us, the opposition is that we want to keep Syria intact. We want to keep all of the different components of society to be part of it. We want to create peace with everyone. It's not just the Kurdish minority that exists, or the Kurdish component that exists in Syria. I've got the Alawites, the Druze, the Christians, the Circassians. There are so many different groups that are existing on the ground. But the Kurdish issue, or the Kurdish element, has taken this big precedent because of this connection to other groups outside Syria that they're getting their affiliation from. We're willing to sit and talk. We're even, like, I know that our opposition has been talking about, because they have been talking about like a federalism, some kind of a federalism that we can create. We're open to anything that will keep Syria intact, that we're not going to divide it and partition it up into territories that are not going to serve the Syrian population as a whole. But everyone in Syria, as the Kurds, are welcome and are part of the Syrian opposition. And this is something very important to remember, because one of the things that has happened now, and I see it's very sad what's happening in places like Afrin in Syria, where the Kurds are put into one group or one category, which is not true, because the Kurds themselves, a lot of Kurdish groups, have suffered at the hand of the PYD. And this has to be addressed, and we have to look with not the double standard, we have to look at all of the violations that are happening in Syria, that are happening in the hands of anyone on the ground, to be kept in account. And this is accountability center. Everybody's violations on the ground, we need to keep records of it, and we need to keep accountability, so that these atrocities will not be happening again and again as we're going forward trying to create a political solution.
Can I say a few things?
Jump in, Mohammed.
Yeah, in general, I think the Turkish campaign in Afrin had made things much worse. It divided up the Kurds and the Arabs more, and incited the violence and the level of tension between the Arabs and Kurds, and somehow. And also, what Turkey tried to do by resettling those who were displaced from Ghouta and from Damascus and Afrin and the houses of the Kurds is specifically bad move, because not only it kind of, the Turks kind of using a wide brush for labeling all the Kurds as separatists, and they are dangers to the Turkish national security, and also trying, because the Arab refugees and the displaced from Ghouta, they don't have a place to go, really. This is the place they were offered, and they will be perceived by the Kurds as those basically group coming to kick them out of their territory and take over their place. So the demographic changes again, which is The refugees and the resettled people has no really influence over it. Like some of those refugees were pushed to Al-Bab, some of them were pushed to Idlib, some of them were pushed south to Daraa, and some of them were pushed to Afrin. So there's that one. And I think the opposition has missed really a big opportunity to bring the bigger Kurdish component. It's true, there's 12 Kurdish party. Me and my family have been very close to the Kurds, actually. And my father grew up in Qamishli. He speaks Kurdish fluently, and he was one of the people who mitigated in the 2004 when the government tried to crash Qamishli after the protest against the government there. But in general, I think it is true with all this diversity in the Kurdish groups, the YPG, YPD, whether we agree or disagree with their national agenda or their national interest, it is one of the biggest groups there. And just recognize the fact they have their interest. That's not aligning actually in line with the interests of the opposition or the interests of Turkey or any interest of the region. And this is one of the files where actually Turkey and Iran will agree exactly, like, we're not going to work with you, we're going to block you from doing your own state. That's what makes Turkey very upset that the US endorsed this component out of the Kurds and the SDF forces. I think the opposition missed a big opportunity really to bring those Kurds in, try to digest some of their demands, try to control some of their demands a little bit and manage their expectations and bring them in to some sort of a national umbrella or under one national group. If you look across the border with Iraq, the Kurds there, they had high expectations and the US let them face their high demands and they paid a bad price actually after the referendum there. So I don't think any country or power in the region would allow a Kurdish state. That's something where Iran and Turkey ally with, and also the United States doesn't want to see this. So when the special envoy to Syria, Staffan de Mistura, or even the Secretary General Guterres said there's fears now Syria will be divided, he does not mean specifically a Kurdish state in the north that imposes national security threats to Turkey. It's more about the territories controlled by Russia and Iran versus the regime versus the opposition.
Oh, that's a very good point to bring in, because particularly sort of the U.S. One of the things I've been toying with is, of course, could the U.S. use the fact that it's still on the ground in the SDF-controlled territories, for example, also to ask the YPG to sort of de-link more. For you were saying external influence is basically PKK, which is also what Turkey is all obsessed about. Because if the U.S. doesn't do it again, then we would, as we've already mentioned earlier, we'd probably have a situation where we'd have sort of the Russians, and we saw that a little bit in the Astana process with the Russian draft for a constitution, which has a sort of very extensive Kurdish autonomy, which is rare because Russians are normally not that interested in autonomy when you look at sort of the way they run the Russian Federation. So clearly there was an idea there to sort of but I'm also think Mohammed's point of saying that the Syrian opposition somehow has to be very interested in doing this, and there could be a sort of U.S. Strategic interest of using that, of saying, because right now the whole thinking is just saying this is all military. These are a good fighting partner. They've been fighting ISIS, so that's great, and that's the military, and it's completely confined to that. And that's, of course, hasn't worked with Turkey. That keeps saying that doesn't ring true. There's going to be a demand by these guys at the end of the road, and you're going to help them sort of build a Kurdish statelet, as you called it, Mike. So again, but I really think there's also seemed to be a lot of complacency around this, the fact that the YPG are there. They are good fighters. When you talked about that the only thing the Assad regime respects is force, I mean, these are actually some of the ones that have been fighting inside Syria with so yeah, so I wanted to throw that those are some of my thoughts. Again, back here to, I don't know, Mike, if you want to jump in, and whether the U.S. again could sort of also, beyond Iran, sort of use the relations they have now with SDF for a political solution.
I'm a heretic on this because I think the key is Turkey, and I think the U.S. strategic interest is to keep the Turks as close to the United States as possible. And I think that the building up of the YPG, which is the PKK, is the thing that has most alienated Turkey from the United States, and it's the thing that has most driven the Turks toward the Russians. And so I think we need to mitigate that. Obviously, we're more than a little bit pregnant on the issue of building up an autonomous area for the Kurds in Syria. But I think that, so I don't think that we can totally abandon that. but I think it has to be balanced against what we owe our Turkish ally. And your idea of decoupling the Syrian Kurds from the YPG is a good one, but it's impossible to do if the United States is sending if the United States is sending a message that it's getting out.
Yeah.
Because everyone's just waiting us out right now, and then they'll do whatever they want after we leave.
Yeah, that was basically going to be my next question to the whole panel, is that even though we've given a lot of good arguments up here for why you could stay from Iran to stabilization to the political solution, is there an element of self-fulfilling prophecy that at the moment you say that you're getting out, it already means perhaps that SDF, the Syrian Kurdish and YPG are reorienting towards Russia, saying they're the ones that are going to stay, Iranians that are there on the ground. So that you could even say that even then, if you then added sort of the whole stabilization work again, it could be lost in the sense that if you know that at some point the staying power just isn't there, then you've already sort of called your game. Mohammed, what do you think?
This is precisely an important point, because one of the outcomes of the U.S. withdrawals could have been negotiation with Russia and Iran, so everybody withdraw from Syria, and for a national peace agreement, be it with Geneva, with Asitana, with heavy U.S. presence and balanced agenda. But now everybody knows the U.S. is leaving anyway. Like, why would negotiate with you if you're leaving? So we heard this from your president. And so we kind of lost one of our cards, kind of showed our cards to the other players, like, oh, we're leaving. And now it tells actually the forces on the ground, be it the YPG and other forces, like, here's the two countries who might stay and will stay longer than the United States. Go and negotiate with them. And that's precisely making Turkey uncomfortable, because from one side, the U.S. kind of flooded and parachuted arms on the YPG and the Kurds. That is not a pleasant story to Turkey, but also leaving those Kurds in the middle will push them directly to go work with Russia. And the Russians will only manipulate the Kurds and the Turks, both. Like, we'll keep you safe, we're not going to allow Turkey to attack you, or we'll let Turkey go into Afrin, and that's what the Russians did. At some point, the Russians prevented the Turkish air forces from flying in Afrin, so the campaign kind of folded at the beginning, but then they gave them a green light to proceed with that. So with the whole stay or not stay situation, the U.S. needs to account for keeping a good alliance and partnership with the Kurds, not only because of the use and the necessity of using them against ISIS, because when you have a strong ally on the ground, you have a voice and a seat on the table of the negotiation. But the U.S. doesn't have any other foothold, actually, in Syria. And also keeping Turkey equally close, because that's our NATO ally and one of the strategic forces in the region.
Can I jump in this also a little bit? We're talking about Kurds and Kurdish and
YPG.
YPG. I'm confusing always the letter in the acronyms. I want to remind that all of these issues, as from my stand when I'm looking at it, is that it can be dealt with and worked with once we have some kind of a force for transition happening for the country. Because all of these issues will be issues that will be on the periphery, and we're dealing with on a long-term basis, because unless we find a solution for Syria as a total, we're going to keep talking about, Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Afrin, Manbij, like who has this control over this area, because now the way there is a de facto kind of control areas in the country. So unless there's some kind of a push, and coming back, maybe this is like the Syrian opposition perspective and that I'm living all the time, is that unless we start some kind of a transition on the ground where we're changing this regime that has behaved with impunity and going for a military solution, not alone, they can't do this alone. With the help of the Iranians on the ground and with the Russians from the air, they will not be able to continue. Therefore, we need to work, the U.S. and the international community, with the leadership of the U.S., need to work with the Russians and Turks, the Iranians, and all of these people that are involved in Syria to create some kind of first steps through Geneva, through a different, format, through whatever that we can push forward, and we prefer that it is Geneva, of course, because that's where we feel the better transition can happen. But whatever can create this wheel of starting some kind of a change in Syria, then I believe, like all of these, like the areas of control, the Kurdish issue, like who's controlling what areas, like all of this demographic change that has been taking on the ground. Now think of Idlib. Idlib has now like about 3 million people. It used to be less than 500,000 before all of the demographic change started to happen. There is this trend that is happening in Syria where we're pushing people who we don't like in this area, who have been living there for thousands of years. We don't like them here anymore. Just put them up to the north because they're not aligning themselves with this regime, or because they supported this kind of, you know, military group that was on the ground, or the brigade. We need to calibrate our strategies that are happening in Syria, and not have each country deal with it. And that's not going to happen unless you have somebody leading it. And there's no leading from behind, like Michael said, and I like that, is that you need to have somebody who's saying, okay, we need to create this transition, and then all of those other things we will deal with as file. But dealing with it as a separate file on the side is going to just keep on going and going back. Yeah, we support them this day. They're a strategic alliance for us with payday today, but maybe not tomorrow. And then we keep changing and changing. Like, what is our interest like right now in this area or this area? And I feel that it has to be a whole solution for Syria in order to arrive to a better solution for all of these different problems.
That's a good segue to also opening it up to all of you. So I'll collect questions, and we will have a question to the panel. So let's start over here.
Lukman Faili. Panelists have not talked about the Iraqi dimension of the Syrian situation. They will have an election next week. Is there any issues to worry about in relation to the interdependency between them, and specifically from the U.S. point of view?
Thanks. Do you want to?
I can make few comments. One, the amazing regime that Nouri al-Maliki established in Iraq, the sectarian regime, and basically over-dependency on militias, that sectarian militias did not really presented a viable governance element to most of the residents in Iraq. And that's therefore when ISIS starts storming to Mosul and to other cities, not through that, 1,000 ISIS hero managed to defeat the whole Iraqi military. No, the Sunnis, they didn't want to defeat ISIS or fight against it, because they wanted anybody, just the devil, to come and kick Nouri al-Maliki out. And if you look, and some of the WikiLeaks cables came from the US Embassy in Baghdad, that Stephen Hadley was telling President Bush, Nouri al-Maliki is a sectarian guy. He changed, shifting the whole structure in the government, and he packed Baghdad with all those pro-Iran militia leaders, and there's over-dependency in militias. And this has been the trend. Now, Maliki was reintroduced to the system, and now if you look at the elections and the assassination campaigns, that for anybody who pose a threat to that pro-Iran bloc in Iraq, there's definitely fear and concerns inside Syria that the more right-wing pro-Iran government in Iraq will mean, and already we have lots of Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, the popular mobilization forces, are fighting in Syria, and the sectarian element of that conflict, the more sectarian elements, pro-Shia, Shia militias coming from Iran, coming from Iraq, the more this will invite for Sunni extremists, and the Sunni extremist version, we've seen it, ISIS. So if you want to eliminate ISIS, the military battle is extremely important, kicking ISIS out, destroy their military capabilities, but also try to address the root causes of establishing and basically the growth of such extremist groups, which is the presence of other extremist ideology that invites the others to exist. So Iraqi election is definitely a point of concern. Unfortunately, there's not much influence to be practiced there. Even the US seems kind of give up on Iraq, and might correct me on this. If you want, sorry.
I don't think they've given up on Iraq. From the military point of view, I think it's kind of the opposite. That, with regard to what I was saying about Syria being an afterthought, the U.S. military, when it looks at the Middle East, tends to focus on Iraq because of all of the investment in blood and treasure in Iraq, and the strategy of countering Iran in Iraq is one of sort of holding on to positions in the state and society that the Iranians don't control and supporting them. It's not actually taking territory back from the Iranians. The same thing is true in Lebanon, where the Iranians are quite happy to take up new positions in Lebanon, but the U.S. is afraid of destabilizing. So there's a fear of destabilizing in Iraq, fear of destabilizing in Lebanon, and a lot of that mindset then transfers over to Syria, where we get this incredibly, incredible fine-tuning of the use of force, so as to not upset anybody, because we're afraid that it'll break up this whole system. But as I say, it's not. They call it a counter-Iran strategy, but that's not what it actually is.
Gentleman down here, and then up here afterwards. Yeah, down here.
Thank you. I have a very narrow question for Mike. Relates to the Russian incursion into denied territory and the instantaneous and very bloody punishment by the U.S. of that. What do you read into the takeaway from that incident? What message does it send? And should we be expecting some kind of response from Russia?
It goes to what I was saying before, but it's like the use of force against Assad. It's very dramatic. It shows awesome military capabilities that the United States has, and changes the political context, because President Obama schooled the American people and the world in the non-utility of American force, the inability of America to do these things, and if it did actually do them, then how counterproductive they would be. So on the one hand, it undermines all of that, but it does not send a message to the Russians or the Iranians, the message that we wanted to send. And that is because it was that use of force was entirely in the service of policing red lines. They were probing, the Russians and the Iranians were probing, because we have sent a message about of ambiguity about our position. They were probing to see if they could go take the oil fields in Deir ez-Zor, and in support of force protection, of protecting our own force and the forces of our allies, we went and we annihilated them. But this was not there was no offensive aspect of this. It was a purely defensive maneuver. And in fact, as General Mattis just said recently, we called up the Russian commander and alerted we have a deconfliction line, and we call military to military, and we called up our military called up their military and said, these guys are organizing and moving toward us. Are they yours? And the Russian military commander said no. And then General Mattis gave the order to, or the commander on the ground, I don't know who it was, gave the order to annihilate them. So there was a coordination with the Russians about this. Now, of course, these are the Syrian equivalent of the little green men in Ukraine. They were Russian assets, but the Russians denied them, and it was only after the Russians denied them that we annihilated them. So we sent a clear message to the Russians that if you move to really change the status quo and threaten the forces directly under that are under our direct support, we will take action. But we have not put any of those military assets and that awesome capability in the service of stopping the Russian and Iranian advances in other areas. It's interesting to me that it was around about the exact same time that the Iranians probed the Israelis with that armed drone, and the Israelis responded by attacking the Iranian base in the Syrian desert. I look at that and I say, wow, look at the capabilities that the Israelis showed, and a willingness actually to threaten the Russians militarily, which is quite awesome, actually. I mean, it's quite startling. And then there's what we did. But both of those actions were taken in support of red lines that we were announced, and they ran in parallel, but they were not coordinated. I look at that and say, what if we coordinated? What if we had a coordinated plan to contain and degrade Iranians? It doesn't have to be George W. Bush, invasion of Syria, regime change, and so on, but contain and degrade militarily, and we work together with the Israelis. I think that would send a really serious message to Tehran and to Moscow. But for all those other reasons I said, the fears about Iraq, fears about Lebanon, fears about staying in Syria, fears about getting involved in a conflict that has no end, people don't want to take that step. I actually think we would have a better chance of getting what we want politically in Syria, so we could get out if we did behave that way. But fear of the opposite is what's going to keep us from doing it.
We have over here.
I'm Peter Humphrey, Intel analyst and a former diplomat. It's a little nutty to bomb a unknown chemical weapons complex on 10 days warning. I'm sure that every computer, file cabinet, and major equipment was moved out of there during those 10 days. If you don't bomb by midnight of the day of the attack, it's kind of pointless. I wonder if we could think outside the box a minute and propose the concept of a multinational force, 4,000 Emiratis, 4,000 Saudis, 4,000 Egyptians, 4,000 Turks, 4,000 Americans, 4,000 Brits, and create a 25,000-man army to stabilize eastern Syria and make it profoundly clear that Assad has no chance of reconquering the entire country militarily. Then he is forced to the bargaining table.
Thanks. Do you want to start out with that?
No need for boots.
There's a lot of troops in Syria.
Yeah, no needs for boots on the ground. Like was established by my colleagues here. It seems that the military capability that the U.S. has command over inside Syria is pretty striking, and also all other militaries that are based in the Mediterranean. You've got the UK, the French. You've got the coalition of the willing that got rid of ISIS. I don't think it needs the will to bring in all of those different troops. There has been, when the will for creating a military difference on the ground, this has been used. You saw Kobani. We saw in Sinjar, we saw in what's happened with ISIS. So I think this could still be done in a way that's limited, that's precise, that's sustained from the air to bring this regime and its allies to the negotiating table.
I'm all positive, but I mean, I'm personally a little bit sort of at least see some options in that opportunity, both because over here, it would reply to demand for increased burden sharing, which is of course why Trump has had such a focus on sort of the Saudi Arabian solution, both of sort of paying and also with troops. And particularly if you saw it in the sort of really multinational framework, but very importantly as well, you'd need the U.S.
presence
as to sort of galvanize that of not saying, hey, but then suddenly we're leaving, because then you could also have the opposite effect of basically particularly you have other Arab countries, further sort of sectarian tendencies be reinforced, and rather than sort of stabilizing force, which was sort of the idea to bring the regime to the table of saying 30%, which is now sort of the SDF-controlled territories are not under your control. They're not going to return until there is a sort of a political solution. Mike?
Yeah, I agree with that, but not just the sectarian issues, or even primarily. There's also the political issues, and the Egyptians are not on the same page with the Saudis about Syria, for example. And my inclination would be to focus on building up local forces that can actually control the area and stabilize the area. And so that when the United States leaves, there will be something to be left behind. Because of our great ambivalence about Syria, and about nation building, we are disinclined to build up the alternative to ourselves. But I think that's what it takes. And so my tendency would be to put the emphasis on military effectiveness over political. So I mean the Emirati special forces and the Jordanian special forces; those are militarily effective units that work well in coordination with Americans, is proven by in other theaters. So maybe use of those kinds of forces if you could convince the Jordanians. But the real the real issue is not holding the territory. Holding the territory in the middle Euphrates River Valley is important, but you will never get out of the Russians and the Iranians what we want if we don't start threatening to take stuff away from them in what they call vital Syria.
I had promised one more here, then one last here, and we have to, within 1 minute. So it's a short question, and we'll have short answers from up here.
Stephen Morris, just wondering, given the fact that that Trump has two incompatible ambitions in Syria, one is to get out and the other is to stop Iranian influence spreading, shouldn't that contradiction be brought forward more often in discussions, number one? And my second question is, if it's in our interests, and it seems from everything that's been said today, to stay in Syria for various reasons, might not we also consider strengthening our position in Syria by surface-to-air missiles, for example, in the Kurdish zone, and maybe even if there is a further offensive against Idlib, to launch airstrikes against Hezbollah, from whom the US has a blood debt of at least 241 Marines?
Well, I can say to the first part of the question that that's precisely what we've done today. That's what's in my paper as well, is basically highlighting some of the contradictions there is in this, around this decision, and that Mike eloquently laid out as well. So that's really been part of what we do here in a think tank of saying here are some of the things that sort of clash in developing a full-fledged Syria strategy. I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in.
Well, on attacking Hezbollah, I just don't see us doing that because of I mean, the distance between where we are right now and that step is so great. There's so many intermediate steps that I'd like to see us just do some of those intermediate steps.
Yeah, one final comment is to Mike's comment about without threatening the Iranians and the Russians, we're going to take things away from them. So the attack in Deir ez-Zor, which was quite a defense, like a step by the US, but also the anti-aircraft missile that appeared out of the sudden in Idlib and brought down one of the Russian jets, and then the drone attacks on the Russian aircraft sitting in Hmeimim air base that destroyed 8 of those aircrafts without really costing much in a small drone. Usually it's kind of attributed to the US or pro-US forces on the ground, which is one of the steps basically could be, if the US still believe in a moderate forces, is to arm some of those forces in Idlib and help them defend Idlib against the Russians as a checkpoint to the Russians that we're here. You're not getting all what you want.
Mariam, any last observations?
Should stay.
On that note, the question of sort of the class theme sort of panel that we had today, should I stay or should I go now, of course has really relevance, I think, as everybody here had shown and sort of shown many of the different reasons. I'm not completely certain that even with all our good arguments that had we sat at the National Security Council whether we would have convinced Trump yet about all these sort of good strategic reasons for really staying on or for even taking on an expanded role in Syria. But it's a question that's going to sort of stay on all of our minds, so stay tuned. I wanted to end on a positive note when we talk about Syria. So I thought actually, Mariam, when you brought out the huge increase in civil society organizations that have sort of blossomed even though there's been a war in Syria, I thought that's something positive as well to take away from even under sort of these conditions, and we mostly only hear about Syria as refugees, as war, as conflict, and but at the same time something beneath the surface of all that is still happening. So I thought that was a sort of good way to end, and then I want all of us to join me in thanking our panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.